So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first Survive and Thrive webinar of 2021. As Helen just mentioned, we've been running these since April last year in collaboration with Gatwick Diamond Business, and this is the 28th in the series. And today we're going to be talking about Greentech. So my name's Daisy and I'm the Community Manager and Marketing Executive at Sussex Innovation in Falmer. And on the panel today, joining me is my colleague Helena, who's our Head of Sales and Marketing, Steve, who's a sustainability consultant and founder of Circular Brighton and Hove, Jordan from Hark Systems, and Leon from Viridian Logic. I'm going to pass over to our panel to introduce themselves. Steve, would you like to start us off?
I'd be glad to. So I am Steve Creed, and I'm actually an innovation advisor as well at the Green Growth, at the Sussex Innovation, as well as being a founder of Circular Brighton and Hove and a coach mentor for businesses interested in including sustainability in their business planning and thinking about where they can go with it. Just a bit about myself, I guess. I've got about 25 years of experience in various things to do with sustainability. I spent quite a long time in the private sector, and then I ended up spending about 16 years in the government side, or public sector more, I guess, in something called the Waste Resource Action Group, where we created things like Recycle Now and Love Food Hate Waste. And more recently, the last couple of years, I've been working on my own down here in the beautiful South Coast, where it's usually very warm and usually quite a lot of opportunities to socialize until recently, as we were just saying, where I've been working with people that are really interested in things like the circular economy. And the reason we set up Circular Brighton and Hove was to try and raise awareness of what circular economy was all about and how businesses can participate in it either in a small way or actually use it as an inspiration for their business as a whole. And I've had the the luxury, of reading the white paper in advance of coming, and there's some really interesting ideas in there. I'm sure we're going to hear about from the other panelists, but there's some really interesting things in there that do follow the circular economy approach.
Brilliant, thank you, Steve. And that's right, we'll be coming back to the white paper shortly. But for now, over to you, Jordan. Tell us a little bit about Hark Systems.
Yeah, I've got a couple of slides as well. Should I throw them up? Absolutely, fantastic. So hello, everyone. My name's Jordan Appleson. I'm the CEO of Hark. Really quickly, can everyone see my screen okay? Fantastic. So Hark technology business. So we set up 5 years ago, and we are kind of a real-time energy analytics and IoT company. And what we actually specialize in is connecting to industry standard sensors, building management systems, energy storage systems, even process automation controllers for manufacturing processes in order to effectively increase efficiency, maximize yield, and reduce waste. Now, 80% of what we do is typically around energy and power. So that's looking at analyzing energy data from assets, from buildings, and then controlling them automatically based on things like predictions and forecasts to basically reduce and optimize their output or optimize for waste energy. So a couple of the businesses we work with, I suppose to note in the UK, so we're heavily, we're working heavily with the supermarkets, so Sainsbury's, Asda. We even have some deployments in the life sciences space, and we're working also with some of the energy providers like the likes of CNG here up north as well. So just a quick background about what we do, like with the supermarkets. In terms of retail, what we've done with the kind of the supermarkets here is basically go in and monitor in real time the energy usage of all the assets from refrigeration systems, lighting systems, buildings, and in real time we're using that data to highlight inefficiencies, to look at potential downtime, and more recently we've been controlling buildings. So if you walk into any one of an Orange supermarkets, big supermarket stores, and you see things like the lights dim or change randomly, that's our technology basically shifting load around based on things like energy prices, as well as trying to dynamically make the building be more efficient, essentially. This is obviously a carbon and green benefit. It also has a cost benefit too. And in a world now where sustainability is key, the cost factor used to be a blocker, and it still is to a certain degree. But now with kind of combining the sustainability and the cost benefits, we're starting to see some real drive across some big enterprises. And I suppose finally, some of the other pieces that we're doing here up north as well, and this one's in Manchester, is controlling energy storage systems based on the usage of the building as well as energy prices. So basically taking buildings off grid when the energy, for instance, is more expensive, and charging up when it's cheaper, but using that essentially to be more intelligent around, well, how much energy is the building using? When should we alter the state of the building based on its power, for instance? And these have huge amounts of, I suppose, benefit from a cost sustainability perspective. And that's what we do in a nutshell. So my background's in software and hardware. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to chatting today about this white paper. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Jordan. And then last but not least, Leon, over to you.
How do you do? I'm Leon of Viridian Logic, a company founded in 2016, about optimizing where and what habitats to place in the landscape, mostly to reduce flooding, but also to reduce diffuse pollution into rivers and to reduce siltation. The way that we do the key problem though is flooding. So flooding is an issue which happens in the UK pretty much annually. We've seen it in the news recently, and it costs somewhere in the order of $1 billion to $1.5 billion to the UK economy each year, just in terms of impact to communities, disturbance to business, and so on and so forth. Now, there are basically ways that we get around this. So generally around building dam walls and putting in spillways and generally engineered works to hold water, excess water in a location until it can flow away. But the other approach is to look further upstream, to look at the landscape and see if it can do anything to slow the arrival of water. So the water will eventually go downstream, but if you can hold it in the landscape for some amount of time, then river levels don't rise dramatically. And the best thing to do this would be putting in nature, habitats, wetlands acting like sponges, trees acting like just filters, generally slowing the flow of water down landscapes. So you figure out where to plant habitats, generally using what we say is GIS, or Geographical Information Systems data. So looking at where all the factors sort of add up to make it a good place to plant. But that doesn't necessarily tell you that that's intercepting flows of water. And on the flip side, you've got hydrology, which is looking at flows of water, but that doesn't tell you necessarily where the best places to be planted are. So Viridian Logic's proposition is quite simple. We figure out where is both good to plant, what to plant, and where it will reduce the most amount of flow. That's reducing your flooding problem, your siltation problems, and your diffuse pollution problems.
Thank you, Leon. Now I'm going to hand over to you, Helena.
Fabulous. Thank you for such amazing introductions. I think I'm going to talk a lot less than I was planning to, because I just want to hear what you've all got to say, actually. Yeah, so my name's Helena, and I do the sales and marketing and some consultancy at Sussex Innovation, working with Daisy and Felix behind the scenes, and Eleanor, who's done some brilliant work pulling together this white paper. And my personal interest in this area is by background. I'm a geographer, and I'm also very interested in permaculture. So that's sort of my interest personally in the angle. It was interesting hearing you talk, Leon, because I can remember when I went to university, one of the interview questions I got asked was, what would you say if somebody said geography was not a discipline in its own right, it was just parts of other subjects? So it was really interesting hearing you talk about that. But anyway, thank you for such amazing introductions. Please do, if you're on, pop any questions that you've got particularly that you want to discuss about clean tech or green tech into the chat there. And I'm sure Daisy will field them to the most appropriate panelist. Otherwise, I'm just going to start, because these guys have had a sneaky peek at the white paper that we've put together. And so I just wanted to pose them the question, actually, in terms of the things that our team at Sussex Innovation have pulled out there as being areas of interest. How much does that sort of chime with you in terms of your areas of expertise about the areas you think we should be, looking to for the future? And also just your slant on how much you think, COVID has changed people's awareness, openness, receptivity to being more green than they might otherwise have been. So that's kind of two questions in one. But anybody like to volunteer to go first, or shall Daisy pick on someone? Steve, brilliant, thank you.
Well, first of all, I can't claim to be an expert in all the areas that were covered, and I think some of the others on the panel will be able to express a lot more expertise as they're featured. But my take on it is that it's really interesting to see the spread that you selected. So Jordan and Leon are both doing quite technical things, which are to some extent maybe allowing us to carry on the way we were, by changing the carbon emissions or relevance of how it works to the environment. Some of the other examples in there are areas that I'm particularly interested in, which is where the technology interlinks with the social side of it. And if we step back a minute and we think a little bit about what's happening with COVID, one of the interesting things about COVID is that they call it social distancing, but they really just mean physical distancing. And the social part is the hard part for us because we all like to get together, have a drink in the pub or talk about things. And so the whole thing about COVID has brought out how important social interaction is to us, not only just in our everyday lives, but also in how we take things forward. It's going to change, I think, because things like offices may not be quite so big anymore. We may work from home. There's going to be different things going on. There's a lot of things in your white paper that touch on various aspects of how the world will change, like being able to have deliveries without carbon emissions, for example, or having a cup that you can, you don't have to worry about having a reusable cup. It's all kind of looked after for you. And so that's the theme of my interest is how will technology help social change to match where we need to go in order to maintain the environment in the way it needs to be for us to survive on Earth, rather than just use it as a way to carry on the way we were, and sort of cover up all the things we're doing that are having a bad effect on it by just do what we did. So I'm really up for the social side. And examples I would give are, for example, the EV vehicle, where they're going to have mini hubs where they're going to manufacture them locally. That's a great idea because it brings people into it, it brings social aspects into it, it brings jobs into it. And other ones, you know, I mean, I don't know how many of you heard of Olio, for example, which is a food sharing thing, which is designed mainly to allow people to share excess food that they didn't want anymore, but was still edible. But what it turned out was it also created a huge social environment because most of the people that were sharing lived locally because they had to bring the food to each other. And they discovered, this started in London actually, and in Haringey, I think, where people would realize the person bringing the pasta to them was actually a person they see on the platform every day getting the train to London to go to work. And they hadn't realized they were even neighbors. So they created all these social links. Or another one they're running in France is a farm supply thing, a bit like a veg box, but instead of having it brought to you, you go to the farmer stall at the market once a week and collect it from him. So then you actually build a relationship up with the farmer. So the technology looks after all the money and the stuff about how it all works. And you just get to go and get your box of vegetables and you meet the person who grew them. Brings the social side in as well as the technical side. And that's what I'm really interested in seeing people think about and inventing new businesses that make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to that point around COVID as well, like what's quite interesting is originally when lockdown originally occurred in kind of March and obviously the effect globally on different countries, my initial reaction was, is the sustainability agenda for not just businesses but countries, governments, going to get pushed back? Because obviously we're in the midst of a global pandemic, we have to divert resources. But what was also really interesting to see was how that didn't actually happen in that way. That was actually a bigger push for it because the data from things like air quality indexes, because no one's driving around and looking at you know the amount of I think was it either in India or China that you could actually see further from like across the horizon than you have been able to in like 30 or 40 years. But what we're trying to do, you know, in these different spaces, is so many moving parts to sustainability. One of the key drivers is technology, right? Technology is an enabler, it's not the solution. But if you look at all these massive enterprise organizations, right, that used to say, oh, for everyone to work from home, for everyone to work remotely, the amount of technical things that we need to do, it's going to take 10 years or 5 years of deploying different systems. And when lockdown happened, you see all these massive organizations doing it in 2 months or 8 weeks. And what's the biggest realization that these businesses have had is the things that they used to think that, hey, it's going to take 10 years to do this technical move over of this technology, even deploying Zoom or Teams or whatever, is going to take this long. That fallacy has been, well, it's completely been proven wrong, right? So how that'll affect the sustainability transformation that we're going through from a technology perspective, I think it's going to accelerate the things that we think we can do, because people believe, people are no longer going to say, well, this is going to take 10 years, right? Whether it's the energy transitions, electric vehicles, you're seeing the output of that. Like, Audi have just kind of set a date for, basically ending all kind of petroleum-based cars. Would that have happened prior to COVID? I'm not sure, because they've obviously had significant changes in the sales of vehicles, etc. So it's hard to say, but I think there's going to be an acceleration. And finally, on that point, there's an element of the electrification of vehicles as well. I think Steve was alluding to. What's quite interesting is how the infrastructure plans for businesses and how there are EV adoption schemes were planning. If you looked at some big retailers and big car parks where they were going to put plenty of EV chargers, because it was also going to encourage people to stay in the shops longer, it benefits both sides. That's changing, because obviously people aren't going to be going shopping in the same way. They're going to go home delivery, which also incorporates another problem of there's more home shopping vans on the road. They need more home shopping vans on the road than they've ever needed. I was speaking to someone at Asda recently, and they said that they've gone from doing something like 470,000 deliveries to 800,000 like slots, and they expected that to be in 10 years time, right? And now it's happened in a year. So there's actually some negative piece, more vehicles, diesel vehicles on the road like that, not great, but it's obviously got the secondary effects, right? So lots of different areas, and I think the white paper kind of touches on various different pieces, including that air quality piece as well, which is very important from the green air perspective.
I'm going to bring a slight counterpoint to the more shopping vans on the road, in that it's fewer road miles per shopping round. So overall, that shopping van is doing the work of 40 family cars.
Yep.
At which point, that's a huge reduction in the carbon outputs.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's whether or not when you go down the electrification of vehicles, like there are options that are affordable for the big players like the Tesco's, Asda's, and Sainsbury's to invest in the electrification of that, because eventually that is still going to be a carbon output. But you're absolutely 100% right. You're basically optimizing 40 deliveries for 40 cars, one car doing, or one vehicle doing that. So I 100% agree on that point, Leon. Yeah.
So I'll jump in and answer Helena's point on the socialization. So Viridian Logic is effectively a data company, despite what we do as being eco-hydrological work. We provide, well, we mung data when we produce the data, and we produce the maps, which starts the conversation, because ahead of time, factors, and you'll still need to do the maths to figure out where's a good place, or go to a hydrologist or hydrology consultancy and figure out where the flows are. But that tells you, the hydrology ones tell you where the problem exists, and the GIS solutions will tell you where the solutions exist. So the key thing that Viridian does, which enables that socialization aspect, is like to combine the two, which enables conversations to be had, one, in terms of what to do, because we tell them what the priorities are and where they exist. We also tell them who to talk to, because we're looking at landscapes which are hundreds of square kilometers around. And if you're looking at a map which just simply says yes or no, you've got 50% of the map saying yes and 50% saying no. And so you don't have no idea where to start. So the extra value that we add is that we do rank statistics on our outputs, and then we supply that in the data, and we try to present that in maps. And admittedly, maps can only give you so much of the picture, but they will give you a guideline as to how to use that data. So that empowers the people who are trying to put habitats into the land to make the best decisions that they can. But also the maps then give them something to go to the stakeholders in the area. That's the people who get flooded, the landowners, the nature reserves, just so they can all be in the same room, looking at the same information, and then come up with their community aspect. We only go so far in terms of saying what to do where. We say it in we say that with a ranked way so that they can make decisions. So it empowers them to make decisions on the basis of, we don't want to place this woodland over here because that's too far away from any community, so they wouldn't enjoy it. We did have plans to plant a woodland over here, but if we move it 200 meters this way, that reduces flooding as well as being a community resource, or a way for the community to enjoy nature. So we're helping them not only optimize where to plant and what to plant, but engage with what's going on the ground so they can make good decisions with useful information. And I think that's one of those things that otherwise you have people getting together and just arguing semantics effectively. So giving them a good reason and a good starting point to enable those conversations is where I think data, or the interpretation of data, is really useful to people in terms of making good sustainable decisions.
That's really interesting, isn't it? As you know, obviously less vans on the road is better than more family cars on the road. And one of the examples that we've got in the white paper, we're teasing most of you, I do appreciate, because most of you haven't read the white paper yet. So you'll have to read it afterwards and let you know what you think. I'm wondering whether, if you want to put a comment in the chat about whether you'd like to have the white paper before the webinar, we'd be interested in your responses. Because we're never quite sure whether to sort of get people involved in a nice, interesting chat and then send them the full white paper, or whether to send them the full white paper and then that'll engage them in the chat. So we'd welcome your views on that. But obviously, one of the companies that we profile in the white paper is a company called Zedify, who we've been doing some consultancy work with, who use electric bikes and trikes to do fossil fuel-free delivery. But it sounds like, you know, that expansion to using electric vehicles for actually car transport has not quite got there yet in time for these new fleets that have been having to be put on the road for the Asdas and Waitroses to get consumer goods to them, to people quite in the middle of this crisis. So can you imagine a future? How far in the future would you say you could see fleets of electric vehicles being used by supermarkets rather than fleets of conventional vehicles?
It's a difficult question to answer, and because of how many moving parts there are. There's actually a question in the chat, I think, by Kate Thorpe about kind of it's seen as a panacea for transportation, but we're kind of moving the problem around, I suppose, the resources to actually, you know, make the batteries, etc., etc. And I think that is a very poignant point, really, because there's that to consider. Obviously, you're shifting away from fossil fuels, but you've still got to process that lithium. You've still got to get these rare earth metals out, and there's only a handful of places in the world that can actually do this. I mean, if you look at it, China is actually probably, even though rare earth metals come from various different places, you know, South America, Russia, you know, etc. There's actually only like 1 or 2 countries that have the proper capacity to process that into what you need. And obviously, you've got to get it from one end of the world to another, and how you do that obviously has a sustainability impact. When it comes to actually deploying EVs, for instance, you've got to have the infrastructure in place, not just the batteries. You need to be able to get electricity to charge the batteries down the wires and be able to charge up the batteries in the cars. The problem we have here in the UK is that in densely populated areas, there's just not enough infrastructure in the right place to be able to support huge amounts of electric vehicles on charge at all times. So that's in the domestic space. In the commercial space, you've then got to be able to do that at scale, like a depot or, you know, a shop. So it's a difficult problem because that all requires investment. It all requires the right technology. There are countless businesses working on different things like dynamic control of charging up vehicles based on the grid demand, right? There's also businesses working on new charging technology, because those chargers, believe it or not, only last a handful of years, and they'll only give you warranty for 5 years because they'll break before that, for instance. You know, a lot of them will. They're not rated for it. And again, you've got that cycle of having to replace parts and shipping things and manufacturing things. So it is a shift. So I don't know what the answer to that question is. I'd love it to be sooner rather than later for lots of different reasons. but I think we have a long way to go, and I think it's going to be, you know, I think it'll be the end of the decade before we see significant, like the significant movements in that front. Personally, although I would like it to be faster, I just think digging up the ground and putting things in it takes a long time, and you've got to invest in a lot of resource to do that, right? Which from a sustainability perspective may actually not. I mean, you're investing that sustainability capital, that carbon capital up front, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's a difficult question to answer.
So I'm going to just hop over. It's simply, again, in terms of building the vehicles, the construction of a vehicle accounts for somewhere around a half of the actual carbon outputs of any given vehicle. So it's not just a matter of like saving the carbon when it's on the road, it's about saving carbon in terms of its production. And I think I'd like to pass over to Steve, who would know more about, I guess, the circularity in terms of the car construction manufacturer, because as far as I know, cars run, then they get old and die, and then they get squished into cubes and thrown away.
Yeah, well, actually, interestingly, a lot of the cars at the moment are recycled, because the steel that they used to make most of the cars is the steel remelted with some mixed in. But a lot of the major brands a few years ago, when I was at RAP and we're talking to people about this, weren't very keen to tell people that their Jag was made 80% recycled steel, for example, because they thought that wouldn't go down very well with their customers. However, they're now more into that sort of thing. On the electric vehicle side, well, there's 2 points. The first point is that carbon, another way of avoiding carbon is using hydrogen as a possible fuel instead of electricity at the point, or turning it into electricity and then using it when you need it. And it has a much higher energy density. So it's likely that large vehicles that move significant amounts of material around, which need to be able to take more energy, might well end up using hydrogen rather than electricity directly. So there's going to be a trade-off maybe between the size of the delivery vehicle and whether it's using electricity or hydrogen. The second point is I actually have an electric car that I charge at charging points, and I also charge at home. And it's a Volkswagen Id3. It came with a certificate that said it was carbon neutral when it was built. So basically, they offset all the carbon they could, and they designed it to minimize the carbon usage in it. So it's a net zero carbon vehicle on design. And then the idea is that when you use electricity to drive it, if you're using renewable energy, and I use a certain supplier, I don't think I'll go into who it is, but it's all 100% renewable, then technically I'm feeling reasonably good about it. But it's an interesting kind of issue, and I would have thought most people don't have the same sort of in-depth interest I have in those particular things which would drive them to do it. It's also not the cheapest option, but I'm very keen on experiencing the opportunities that there are. So I decided I'd take the plunge this time.
Yeah, without wanting it to become a whole Volkswagen show, yeah, I was looking at the ID3 and ID4 with great interest. So, yep, I want one of those. But also the
we can
electric.
have a chat later, Leon.
So I just wanted to have a little scan through the comments that are coming in chat here, and I think we've got a question as well. But thank you for being so engaged, everybody. It's really nice that we know that we're doing something right, I think, when we're engaging people like this. So yeah, Jan's saying here, you know, the rise in green prescribing, but the impacts of environment planning. So there's a question there. I'm not sure who would like to take a view on this. But in terms of the impacts on all the views on how tech can enable greater collaboration between groups with shared interests, that's a nice crossover actually between all three of you, in fact, the social elements and the tech elements.
I suppose if I'm being completely honest, I might not be the best person to jump in on here. The point about how tech can enable great collaboration between groups with shared interests, that I can talk about. In terms of the healthcare and medical profession and green prescribing, I'm not an expert, so apologies if I get for making any faux pas. But I suppose if you look, so Hark are currently on a program by Tech Nation called Net Zero, right? And what's really interesting is that there is an increased, I suppose, from tech companies, startups, that kind of space, working on all these different things we talked about. In the white paper, there's a mention of a company that I think are on the net this program as well, that basically do reusable cups. So you're not, you effectively using disposable cups across different like, I suppose, cafes. So on the tech side at the moment, there's a massive increase in the amount of businesses collaborating, or at least on programs, sharing interests around sustainability in the environment, whether it's from companies that like Hark to businesses that are doing smarter dynamic energy systems, to being able to buy carbon, like basically like offset your own personal carbon emissions by paying monthly to a company that will do that for you. And there's loads of different opportunities to collaborate that we've seen, and it's been fantastic. I think the key thing is, how do you kind of quantify the benefits of all these different things, whether it's through collaboration or it's even your own technology. And that's kind of the difficulty. So there's definitely, tech is definitely enabling collaboration, like just the sheer people having the sheer thought of this product could help X, Y, and Z, and then going and talking about it with other businesses. You end up collaborating. It's fantastic. I think the key thing is kind of quantifying the benefits and how those shared interests can work for net positive movement of whatever the thing is, whether it's carbon or sustainability, etc., etc. But we're definitely experiencing that for sure. There are businesses I had never heard of and things I'd never heard of, and I learn a lot, and I'm like, oh my goodness, is this really the case? So yeah, definitely there's definitely greater collaboration for sure.
Sorry, did you want to say something, Leon, first? I think that it's a great opportunity for collaboration on health sides, because the whole sort of thing about where all this fits together, getting out and doing something. I've been working with someone actually on an interesting idea where they're going to try and create the Pokemon of litter. And the whole idea is to gamify, use gamification to get people out collecting litter and doing things with it, and identifying it and putting it in the right place, and also using that information as a generator for revenue. But what's better than a whole generation of young people out there using their phones to take pictures of litter and scoring points and getting rewards and getting exercise and cleaning up the environment at the same time? I mean, what a great collaboration that is, yeah?
I think there's a slight perverse incentive there for them to then litter and take pictures of it. So I mean, it's a case of it's starting to be thought about. So there's at least some thinking behind how do you stop that sort of thing from happening as well. But I mean, it's not just in isolation, just people and technology. It's about linking together communities, and not only social in a social sphere, but also in the business sphere. There's been a conference which I used to get, well, it's a case it didn't happen this year because of reasons, which is called the World Forum on Natural Capital, which is primarily accountants and economists, and they're convinced that they can save the world, which I thought was, okay, that's a bold mission statement. How? And it's just by considering the environmental impacts. If you have a spreadsheet which doesn't include the cost to the environment, you discount it as being a freebie. If it's not valued, then you never consider the impact or the harm that it does. Whereas putting it on the spreadsheet as being a negative cost, you can then start to balance these things, which is why you can then get to net zero, or indeed produce a carbon neutral car, which is great. But again, it's just having those considerations for all the people who can get involved in any which different way, including more business function style things, because they know how to run the numbers. They've got the systems in place. They just haven't included it into their thinking. And by bringing people in and saying, this is the thinking that we want to see, we will be able to develop these relationships and socialize networks not in society, not only just between people, but between businesses and people.
Could I just comment on that, Leon? I think that's a really great point, but I think it was George Monbiot that said that as soon as you start valuing things, then you're starting to think about how you can sell them. And so he isn't so keen on the idea of valuing the environment because he's worried about what it might do in terms of if we carry on with the current economic system, the way in which people might use that information. And what you're highlighting for me, and this is getting a little off the topic, but it feels to me like one of the biggest challenges when I talk about circular economy is we all understand the circular bit, which is we're going to get as much use out of the stuff as possible. But the economy bit, which is maybe the old economy rather than some new economy that allows us to think about the world in a different way, which COVID may accelerate because we may all be so much in debt that we decide we don't really want to measure it that way anymore, is a real challenge. And what you're describing is probably a step on the way towards a point where we decide to measure success or the benefit of a country rather than by GDP, by how happy everybody is or how few cases of COVID they have or something like that, as a way of transitioning to somewhere where value is properly measured and would include the environment and social aspects as well as the economic aspects, because they still don't value the social side very much, you know?
Again, we see it in the past year that people have generally stayed indoors. It's a case of not for their own well-being, but for the well-being of everyone around them. We've done the social distancing, we've done the wearing of the masks, and we continue to do so. Not because it brings us any joy to do so, but because we realize that our shared community is important. And I think that everyone doing their part, or as long as people know that they've got a part to play in terms of having a more sustainable and indeed a greener and safer and better future, they will agree. And as long as they're given that information or given that power to know that they can do something and bring the agenda forwards.
Well, we're getting some interesting questions and comments in here now. We've released our white paper halfway through. I'm not sure whether half the people are now reading the white paper rather than listening or multitasking or starting to fire questions at us. But there's some questions coming in the chat, which I think I'm going to go to. Interesting, starting to touch on that sort of area of the triple bottom line of financial, social and environmental balance sheet. The question here from Lee Barker. Thank you, Lee. Leon, fascinating work. I'm interested if you can tell us who your clients are looking at such big areas of land. Do they tend to be governmental, corporate or other? Who are you mainly working with, Leon?
So mainly working with local authorities, county councils, city councils, as well as, say, wildlife trusts. I think the biggest people that we've ever consulted for was being the Crown Estate, but they own lots of pieces of land everywhere. We have talked with RSPB, generally people who have large pieces of land to manage. They want to do better for the environment because otherwise the environment degrades under their watch. We've not really looked at tying in with corporates other than for, they occasionally do environmental competitions, which we enter and we discuss what to do with them. And likewise for innovation grants, we team up with other corporate entities to figure out how we can help them with their sustainability goals with regards to land management. But our primary client base is local authorities.
Thank you. And then there's another question here from Lee as well. Steve, can you see both hydrogen and EV developing in parallel? And in terms of investment capital, which is something we'll touch on later, actually, because we're just in the process of developing our own impact-led investment arm with Sussex Innovation. Or do you think that they would be? Do you think they're going to compete as the solution?
Well, I think that depends a bit on where they go. I mean, at the moment, I think most of the car manufacturers for family cars and things like that are pretty heavily committed to the idea of using electric as the route forward. and that's the way they're getting signals from the government to do it. And so therefore, I think that might be the way they go. They probably won't. I mean, there are people on the fringe trying to convince people that hydrogen family cars are the right way to go, but they're not really catching on. However, in the area of large vehicles, as someone already said in the chat, there are quite a lot of hydrogen-driven larger vehicles for transport of goods and things that are coming on the market. And so I think it might be more about the market segment that you target the fueling system on. So smaller vehicles, electric would work quite well, especially if you got rid of the steel and made them out of fiberglass, as certain people are doing. Reduces the weight. You can get quite a lot of distance, and you don't have your mileage anxiety. But if you're trying to, if you're trying to move an 18-wheeler with lots of material in it, electric probably isn't going to be right answer. So hydrogen will. So I think the investors will see them as two separate markets, and they'll invest accordingly. So I think there's enough for both.
I'd agree with Steve. I mean, it's not a case of one winning over the other. This is why we still have petrol and diesel cars.
Diesel originally wasn't, it was a byproduct, right? And it took some investment to get it to the point where you got the turbo diesel engine, which allowed people to use it as and they touted it to be much cleaner, right, than petrol. Obviously, look how wrong they got that. But it's a similar thing, I think. There's also different options for hydrogen as well. Like, there's hydrogen fuel cell technology, and there's hydrogen, that can generate electricity, and then there's hydrogen gas, and there's various different, I suppose, research and development efforts going into hydrogen. I know there's definitely the introduction of hydrogen to like gas mains, right, as well for heating networks, right, which has a sustainability benefit too. So hydrogen has a place, I suppose, if I'm not mistaken, and I might be wrong here. So some scientist who's in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong. As much as it's the most abundant element on our planet and possibly in the universe, we still have to extract it. So it's not just there for the taking. We have to separate it, whether it's from water or whatever, which again requires, it's kind of chicken and egg. So again, you could make the argument that you were extracting lithium, etc., processing it, but you still have to get that technology in the right place for it to be efficient, sustainable, and investable to a certain degree. And that comes back to the economy as well. It's like if you look at a company like SpaceX, right, as an example, as a case study, they are a private corporation that are now sending astronauts up to the space station, right? They've done it for much cheaper than the bill from NASA or ULA, etc., in terms of how much investment they put into it, because they're a private company in the way they've operated. But that's still taken private capital to deploy it, to invest in it. And this is, from an economic perspective, it's why it comes back to the point around, wouldn't it be nice if the economy valued happiness and health and sustainability rather than valuing it in like monetary terms in that kind of way? And again, it's a whole other discussion probably for another time, but it's a prime example of why you see one technology overtake the other, and it's predominantly due to investment into it, and people have a lot to lose if it doesn't work, even if it's the wrong technology. Like same happened with nuclear reactors, the type of nuclear reactors that they originally built. We can make weapons from the byproducts, so we'll invest in this technology rather than the one that's much safer and can't melt down, etc. And it's driven by other factors, unfortunately. What we can do to change that is continue having conversations like this and getting the word out. But yeah, that's a whole separate conversation.
Yeah. But I think, Jordan, it is important that measuring. I was being a little facetious saying measuring happiness, but ultimately, the really big thing that's driving it is time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the big challenge here is, how soon do you want to get a return for your investment is the really important thing to consider. And in most of the sustainable discussions that I have with people, in the discussion I have about finance and sustainability, the problem is that the return you get for making a good sustainable investment often takes longer to come back. And the markets are designed to be able to make a quick profit rather than a continuous return. And so that is the challenge for that. Why would hydrogen or electricity win? It somehow it becomes a race. Well, it shouldn't be a race. It should be like we're all working together because we're solving the problem where it meets best. And that's a bit of a, where does competition lie in as opposed to things?
This is sorry, Jordan, you want to go first?
I was just gonna say nail on the head, really. Like, and just to add to that, just before you lay on, I see businesses that have startups, right? That pitch, and maybe I'll ask for advice, and their business plan says, this is a technology for the year 2040, and as soon as they say that, every investor in the room's like, right, come back in 25 years, kind of thing, and that's a shame because you need that long-term patient capital. And by patient capital, the definition of patient capital now is like 10 years, right? You might get investment companies that are investing in long-term asset life cycles, 20, 30 years, that kind of thing, separate. So you look at startup technology investors these days, they're looking for a return within 3 to 5 years. You look at patient capital, that might be 10. You're looking for investment to solve something that's going to be a 2040 problem, or it's going to be solved where the market's going to be there in 2040. You kind of need the governments to really push for that in a way that makes sense for the private investors, and it's unfortunate. It really is. Sorry, Leon, go on.
And so I was going to hop on to Steve's point about it not being competition or to necessarily get to first, but more to work with what's everything which is going on the ground, which is, again, Viridian logic we aren't going out there and planting the trees and just going, this is the right place, we're doing it anyway. We have to get buy-in from those people who are the landowners. And number two, we have to make clear that it's a case of, you can't just expect the forest to be there the day after you've planted it. These are long-term solutions. And sustainability is about making things long-term, we want lasting change, not just quick fixes which fall apart the next day or the next week.
Yeah, balancing that is very difficult, in every sector. I think there was a question in the chat earlier about are companies investing in this technology knowing that it's almost a bit of a loss leader and expecting it to get cheaper? Well, it's a great point. Yes and no. For businesses like retailers, as you can imagine, who are already a low margin business, right? They're not investing just because it's the right thing to do, unfortunately, because if they did that, they wouldn't be able to do the thing that they need to do, which is, I don't know, ship a can of beans, which is kind of what I go to Sainsbury's for, or Asda or Tesco. So there is a balance, and it's getting to the point where people are using, rightly asking, they're asking the right questions from a sustainability perspective, but the business case has to stack up. It has to have payback in a number of years, 5 years maybe at the limit, and it has to have the sustainability benefit. And that's kind of the nice thing now, is people are going, well, what are the sustainability benefits? First step. But at the same time, the technology is getting, I would say, cheaper. It's more easily accessible, because look at you've got commodity hardware coming down. Back in if you look at how much a smartphone costs, with GPS, accelerometers, the cheap ones from Samsung, 50 quid. That 10 years ago wasn't a thing, right? The chips are getting smaller and faster. You can do more with that for cheaper cost per unit. Put that at the edge to control devices, to make buildings more intelligent, whatever. That's being commoditized, and getting to the point where it is cheaper and easier to deploy. But at the same time, it's still a cost. You want to deploy tens of thousands of these things out. We're talking about 7 figures potentially. That's a lot of money, right? And in a COVID pandemic where retailers are hit in different ways, supermarkets slightly differently. Their cost to operate has actually gone up. To service the same amount of product, their cost to operate has gone up, not down. They might be making record revenues, but their profit margins are actually taking a bit of a nosedive to a certain degree in certain areas like groceries. It's a problem, unfortunately, that this technology, to do the right thing, it costs money, and you need to get the buy-in from the right people. So I hope that answers the question. It's a difficult topic in itself, but yeah.
I think it is. I mean, there's just such multifaceted issues, from the structural structural, societal, psychological. It's very, very multifaceted. Another question here, just in the chat, wanted to come to Hayden. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing you. How do you think we can regulate, or can we regulate greenwashing? For example, companies like Coca-Cola, Nestle, P&G, etc., the big ones, making claims like 100% recycled plastics by 2025, despite contributing enormously to the problem in the first place.
Well,
I'm not going to start by answering that.
I think this might be the sunken cost fallacy, in that you can do something about the stuff which you've already done, despite the fact that that cost, or the impact of that cost, has already been borne by effectively the world. So it's one of those things that, but that might be the example rather than the leading question. So in terms of the example of like the promising of recyclable plastics or reduction of plastic, you give them as much kudos as they're due for that. If they don't pull out of the bag, then you give them exactly the kudos that they're due for not pulling out of the bag. And this is, in that respect, private companies are only responsible to their market share, not to any sort of democratic process. And that's capitalism. But
well, capitalism focused only on a financial bottom line and a double-digit return to Wall Street, right? In those companies' cases.
It's a case of, well, but social buying will sell products. I mean, it's a case that we see this in things which will be marked themselves as green, which is now we're going into the greenwashing thing, where it's a case of, do you think we can regulate greenwashing? I don't think so, because it's just generally we're trying to innovate at the edge of greenwashing. So then, by regulating that edge, where we're trying to make things more sustainable, you limit the rate of progress that we can make in terms of making things more sustainable, the economy more circular, and so on and so forth. So it would actually work against being able to adopt more sustainable practice quicker by having sort of a regulating greenwashing edge.
I totally agree, Leon. I mean, I think the fact that Coca-Cola wants to say they're going to have 100% recycled plastic bottles by 2025, I remember back in 2003, we were talking to them about using 20% recycled content in their plastic bottles, and they weren't very interested in it, partly because they couldn't get the plastic back to recycle it because the systems weren't there. Which highlights a really important point generally for me about this. Well, there's 2 points. One is that businesses are starting to make claims about recycled content, about sustainability. Often they're selling things on the back of it. I mean, there's television advertisements where people are talking about washing liquids that mean you don't have to wash your clothes so often, and we're not having so many clothes go to landfill. I mean, for someone who spent years and years trying to get stuff diverted from going into landfills, it's a wonderful world we're living in nowadays. So I'm quite happy about that. And if they're making claims that aren't right, I think several people have already highlighted, ultimately they're going to get called out for it. So that is I think that's kind of, democracy will prevail in the end in most cases, in my opinion. But the other thing that comes into all this is it's a really big system again, right? Putting drinks in plastic bottles is because we want to buy them in plastic bottles, but it's also really efficient and it's lightweight, and plastic's wonderful. What we need is a good way to get the plastic back again, to use it again, because once you make something into plastic, there's no more carbon emissions ever again. Okay, it's not so good for wildlife, but if we're going to all end up being cooked, then maybe we don't need to worry about wildlife. That's a bit controversial, but you've got to get your priorities right here. So you have to think through where the system is and how it's going to happen. So
yeah, it's about the correct valuation of that impact. I mean, to make a plastic bottle is cheaper than recycling one. So that's a perverse incentive right there to just make bottle. I mean, it's a case of one of my favorite quotes, and I forget where this is from, is that bottled water companies are plastic bottle companies, not water companies.
Yeah, so really, really interesting. There's lots of just really great chat going down the side here. I'm conscious we're kind of getting a little bit close on time, so I'm just going to check whether there's any more questions We've got one more question
Yeah,
here, but there's
one
just
more
some great
comment.
chat going on. It's really lovely to see everybody connecting. You know, it's lovely to see, you know, Kate from the university there offering to make introductions that have already been made to Leon, that's already going on behind the scenes. And, you know, this is a big part of what we do through the university and through Sussex Innovation is we make these connections between people who've got different parts of the same puzzle, as everybody here has got different ideas and different things to contribute to these really important things. So it's just really nice to see so much engagement in the chat. Thank you for that. And the fact that those links have already been made. Great comments here by Anya and by Jane in terms of, you know, the voting power of the consumer. We're seeing every day. Ellen has already just sent me some new information that's come in since we've been on this call in terms of a new poll and the importance of climate crisis to future generations, who are the future consumers of the retailers and the plastic bottle manufacturers and, you know, all of these companies. So things will change, and whether that's by the big companies, you know, retrofitting, whether that's greenwashing or not greenwashing, discuss the social and environmental credentials that people require these days increasingly, or whether that's by challenger brands coming into markets and doing things differently, you know, remains to be seen. But I just wanted to come to a couple of points before we finish. I'm going to give all of the panelists a chance to give us a parting comment, maybe something they think we should keep an eye on over the next, I was going to say year, but I feel that's too short a time scale now, having been, you know, this type of stuff takes a long time. So maybe over the next 5 years, what their hot tip for something to watch is. So I'm just going to give you the heads up on that while I carry on talking. But one of the things, you know, if any of you do want to share the white paper, we'd really love that. We're starting to do these white papers to provoke comment, to provoke these kind of debates, to have a look at what's out there, to see what people think are going to be the next big thing. So we'd love you to share it. We'd love you to share it widely on social media to start getting the fact that we're now creating these white papers, and we're going to be creating these white papers for every webinar now, so that we've done some thinking up front. And so, as you guys have highlighted, you can have done some thinking about some questions you want to ask before the webinar as well. So we'll move to that model. Thank you for giving us that feedback. We are working with all sorts of companies in this sector at all stages of their development. So some of the companies in the white paper are companies that we have been doing consultancy with. And what we've developed in the last year as a response to the fact that we've never really had that last piece of the puzzle for entrepreneurs who want to get serious investment in their companies is we've launched a branch of Sussex Innovation called Sus Ventures. And I think Daisy's about to drop the link for the website there. So if you do know Felix, in fact,
Felix beat me to it. He's on
behind
it.
the scenes, Felix. Thank you. So if you do have companies who are looking to scale and are looking to have, whether that's social or environmental impact on the world, as well as make some money, do connect them to Sus Ventures or connect them to us for some help in, you know, getting their message out there. And we work regularly with some of the people on this screen who are more expert in some of these areas than we are. So, but it's been great. So I'm going to come to the panelists there. You're looking
I've actually
very
got
thoughtful.
one
okay,
last
Daisy's
question
got
that's
one.
just come in, which hopefully, I think we might run over, but hopefully everyone's got a couple of extra minutes. What do you think of waterway management with sustainable fisheries, conservation, food supply and transportation? Could they be used beneficially with Greentech? Leon, do you feel, would you like to take that one?
That's just looking at everything to do with water. Okay, in terms of waterway management and sustainable fisheries, I'm vegan, so I really don't think there's such a thing as sustainable fisheries. There are sustainable fishing practices which can be done. I mean, it's one of those things that, like growing oysters on a rope, great, fantastic, keep going. They filter the water as well. Everyone wins. Conservation, again, I really appreciate the work that conservationists do in terms of keeping the nature that's already there. But I'm always heartbroken by the fact that it's a losing battle, because you're winning when nothing changes, and if things change, you're losing. So, I mean, this is a sort of battle that I'm fighting in terms of Viridian logic, which is just putting in more nature into the landscape. So fighting that side, flipping the coin, as it were. Food supply and transportation, those are again eminently sustainable. There's so much food waste which occurs in the world, and in terms of transportation, we just need everything to be linked up in a more effective way. So there's definitely lots of work to be done in terms of logistics and making that sustainable.
Thank you. Sorry, and I'll hand over to Helena for final comments.
Thank you. It's a really big area. If you have got comments or questions on the white paper, given that we didn't send it to you in advance this time, then do let us know what those are, because we can certainly come back to you with some more answers to some questions or some more information about a particular area that you're interested in, or some connections to that company. If you want to connect to any of these guys on the screen, please let us know.